al sector bancario. Vamos a hablar con Octavio Marenzi, CEO de Opimas LLC. Octavio, good morning, good afternoon, sorry.
Good afternoon.
Octavio, you've spoken lately about how now Switzerland will be viewed as a financial banana republic, you said, versus the financial center that it was before, that it was considered before. What consequences do you think this will have, the thing about Credit Suisse, on the Swiss economy?
Well, I think ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to see some assets seeping out of Switzerland, trying to find their way into other offshore financial centers. So if I look at the private banking and the wealth management business, which is such an important part of Swiss banking, I would expect to see, first of all, the bigger banks lose some volume to some of the smaller banks within Switzerland, but Switzerland as a whole to lose business to offshore centers like Singapore and maybe to a lesser extent to Hong Kong. So I think we'll see a shift there around and them lose money to those financial centers. In the investment banking side, I think the big beneficiaries are going to be the big four American investment banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley. Those four are the dominant players there, and I think they'll pick up Credit Suisse's market share there.
You've said that UBS deal is bound to generate legal and political resistance, the acquisition of Credit Suisse. Why do you say this?
Well, basically with the Federal Council, which is like the presidency of Switzerland, so sort of the 7-member Federal Council, announced on Sunday that they were going to take Credit Suisse and give it to UBS. And they've determined what the price is going to be, and they structured the whole deal without even asking the Credit Suisse shareholders. Now, that you could consider to be basically confiscation, perhaps even an illegal confiscation of Credit Suisse shareholders' property and handing it over to UBS at much, much less than it was just trading at on Friday afternoon. So that looks very suspicious. Now, the Federal Council claimed to have emergency powers within the Swiss Constitution to do that. I believe that those powers within the Swiss Constitution basically are designed to protect Switzerland if there's a foreign attack or something of that sort where you really have no time to respond. To use it to rescue a bank, and in particular to rescue a bank and give it to another bank, it seems to be a bit of a stretch. So there's already legal challenges coming, we understand. Some of the pension funds who'd invested in Credit Suisse are preparing that. Even the Swiss Parliament itself is looking at this closely. They've launched a committee to look at the Federal Council's actions there to see whether they were legal. And I expect to see Credit Suisse shareholders come in large numbers and contest this deal and say this was not right. You gave us away our property for far too little money.
You also said, Octavio, that Credit Suisse saga is not yet over. Do you say this because of what's happened with Deutsche Bank, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think the deal with Credit Suisse is not over because there will be these challenges. So there are going to be these legal challenges that are now gathering pace, and I expect in the coming weeks and months we'll see an increasing number of those. Basically, entire classes of shareholders will come and say, we're unhappy about this. We feel that we had our shares taken away from us and given far less for them than they were worth. So that is going to be the challenge there, and they're going to challenge the Federal Council's constitutionality in terms of doing that. In terms of other banks now, not over. Yes, I think this banking crisis that we're seeing unfold is not finished yet. Just today we saw Deutsche Bank's share price go down about 15%, though it's recovered a bit now as well. That seems to be the next domino to fall in this process. So Deutsche Bank is now coming under attack. We'll see what happens in the coming days, but these things can move very, very quickly, as we've seen with Credit Suisse and some of the US banks. A bank that looks perfectly fine suddenly overnight is insolvent and cannot repay its depositors. So there is a risk that this is spreading into other parts of the European banking sector and the US banking sector. We've seen First Republic Bank under tremendous pressure again in terms of its share price over the course of the past few days. It does not look like this is over.
You just said, Octavio, that it seems that Deutsche Bank is the next domino piece to fall in the process. But why? Why is Deutsche Bank now being targeted by short sellers? And which problems does this bank really have?
Well, Deutsche Bank has been an underperformer for many, many years. So Deutsche Bank has had to go through a series of restructurings time and time again. And it looks a bit like the market is sort of trying to pick on the weakest bank they can see and jump on that and push its share price down and basically create all sorts of difficulty and problems for them. So that seems to be the process that we're seeing. unfortunately, some of these banks are not able to resist that very well because they have very large portfolios of bonds and securities and loan portfolios that have lost in value as a result of increasing interest rates. So as those interest rates have gone up in the US and in Europe, their balance sheet on the asset side has suffered tremendously, and they've lost a substantial portion of the value there. And it's very difficult for them to make that whole up again. So that is why the markets are looking at the banks right now. We've seen this tremendous dislocation in terms of sharply increasing interest rates, and that is going to cause some banks to break. And so the markets investors are basically looking for which banks are most likely to break. Now, Credit Suisse had a long few years of all sorts of scandals and problems. Deutsche Bank has had its own financial problems and difficulties being profitable. So that is why the markets are now turning on Deutsche Bank.
Octavio Marenzi, CEO of Opimas LLC, thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.